Good afternoon. I'm Pamela Blue. On behalf of myself and my colleague Cindy Hepfer, welcome to the first in a series of ALCTS webinars on institutional repositories planned for this spring. Our presenter today is Greg Tananbaum. Greg is no stranger to ALCTS, having given keynote presentations for 2 ALCTS Midwinter Symposia, in Seattle in 2007 for Definitely Digital, and again in January of this year for the meeting on institutional repositories. Today's presentation is based loosely on his remarks from the Denver meeting, and I am sure that the broad overview he provides will be most useful. And now I will turn the webinar over to Greg.
Can everyone hear me okay?
Perfect.
Great. I'm going to start my show. And hopefully, can everyone see that all right? I'm assuming yes. Thanks for joining us today. And I think we should have an interesting discussion of the past, the present, and the future of institutional repositories. I'm going to start with just a bit of housekeeping. The webinar is scheduled to run for about an hour, but if anyone has to sign off earlier, that's certainly not a problem. All attendees are muted right now, and if you have a question or if you're having a technical problem, you can let me and the organizers know by entering text into the little box that says type message here. There's a question box, and I'll see that, and I'll be able to address that either directly or by IMing you back. But without much further ado, I think we should just dig in. As Pamela said, my name is Greg Tananbaum, and I'm a consultant who has spent the past dozen or so years working at the intersection of technology and content and academia. In the 1990s, I was the director of product marketing for EndNote bibliographic software. And for much of this decade, I helped to start and then run the Berkeley Electronic Press. In that capacity, as both a publisher of some 30-odd peer-reviewed born digital journals and also the leading vendor of institutional repository software, I had a pretty good vantage point for many of the more important developments in scholarly communication. And of late, I've been working as a consultant to publishers, to information providers, libraries, universities, and so forth on a variety of scholarly communication issues, one of which has been institutional repositories. Now, I was very pleased and honored to be invited to speak with the ALCTS group at their annual meeting in January, and to be asked to reprise my talk with you today. I thought I could get the ball rolling by providing a very brief history of the IR space, talking about what the initial promises of the institutional repository concept were. And then we could talk about, what do we think the IR was going to do for us, and how well has that reality matched those expectations. Basically, how did we get to where we are today, and how bumpy has that road been, and what does this really portend for the future? Following that, we'll talk about how institutional repositories can and should fit into the larger scholarly communication landscape, and also what the future might hold for institutional repositories. So let's dig in. So the first glimmer of what would become today's institutional repository flickered to life around 2000 with the launch of the ePrints platform, which was built at the University of Southampton off of the Cogprints frame. But I think that most people would agree that the IR era really began in earnest in 2002 with the launch of DSpace and Digital Commons as platforms to complement ePrints. So without further ado, we'll step back in time to that magical year of 2002. You'll recall that the euro finally went into circulation across the continent. Sarah Hughes was America's sweetheart at the Salt Lake City Olympics. Austin Powers faced his toughest and I think most hilarious challenge with Goldmember. And Britney Spears endured frenzied media speculation about her mental state and her musical future. I mean, it seems like only yesterday that we were there. But more directly related to IRs, Digital Commons and DSpace made institutional repositories accessible for the first time, albeit in different ways. What DSpace did is it rendered a do-it-yourself IR solution a truly attractive possibility for the first time. And that was due in part to the strength and the flexibility of the software, and also in part to the validation that MIT's and Hewlett-Packard's interests gave the notion of institutional repositories. Digital Commons, on the other hand, demonstrated that the private sector thought that there was something to this institutional repository concept. It also threw the weight of the University of California, which was Bpress's first customer, behind the push to promote IRs as an important development in the scholarly communication realm. Soon enough, what we saw was that there were lots of institutions that were experimenting with ePrints, with DSpace, with Digital Commons, and with a handful of other systems that popped up. And by 2005, the Directory of Open Access Repositories included some 500 IRs worldwide. Today, just 4 years later, that number exceeds 1,300. The question to me, or the question I think we need to ask, is why? Why do so many institutions have repositories? What do they want from them, and are these expectations being met? So that, that's where I think we'll dig in a little bit here. And let's talk a little bit about the primary promises of the institutional repository. So I think there are six promises that entice institutions to implement IRs from these gold member days onward. The idea that we could see a concrete response to the scholarly communications crisis, that we could have an expanded access to scholarly information, that we could highlight the depth and breadth of an institution's intellectual output, that there would be an accelerating effect on the information wants to be free movement, including open access, and that we would see a potential breeding ground for a new generation of university-founded and funded e-journals, and that we would have in all of this, we would see low adoption costs for authors. So let's spend a little bit of time breaking down each of these promises. The first promise, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about, in fact, I'm not going to spend any time talking about the scholarly communication crisis of the 1990s onward. I think it's sufficient to say that libraries were asked to pay a lot more for access to information. And institutional repositories were a tangible way that institutions could, at least on some level, strike back, for lack of a better term. Institutions could use IRs to disseminate intellectual materials directly to the world without the publisher as intermediary. And in some ways, I think this would serve as a warning shot across the bows of publishers. I am aware personally of at least 2 instances where major universities use their IRs, and the specter of depositing lots of articles written by their faculty into the repository as part of a big deal licensing renewal negotiation. And I think one tangible outcome of the introduction of institutional repositories into this mix was the coalescing of publishers' policies regarding postprints. Most publishers now allow schools to post some version of a published article, again, typically a postprint, in the institutional repository. And we're going to revisit this in the results portion of the talk in just a few minutes. The institutional repository also showed potential in staunching the long decline of certain types of scholarly materials. Here I'm thinking most obviously about monographs, which have suffered greatly over the years due to their niche market, their high fixed costs, and their low print runs. But also this would encompass materials like handbooks and Festschriften and conference proceedings. These content forms could potentially be produced and disseminated at a much lower cost than ever before via the institutional repository. Excuse me. The second promise, expanded access to scholarly information. Beyond traditional peer-reviewed publications, the Internet showed us that less formal, more in-the-moment communications might have value. The IR became seen as a great place to collect this great literature, for lack of a better term, under one roof. And in doing so, the hope was that these materials would be more easily discoverable to a wide audience, that there'd be less need to wade through the various departmental and personal web pages where these materials were previously stored. And what we saw is with the rise in bandwidth capabilities and the drop in storage costs, the timing of the institutional repository coalesced nicely with the ability to transfer and manipulate big fat files. Data sets and multimedia files and executables that were unlikely to be published as part of a journal article could certainly add value to the scholarly conversation, rather. And the IR was viewed as a convenient mechanism to categorically collect and categorize and disseminate this type of information. I'd also say that regardless of the content type, an increasing concern as scholarly materials migrated to the web was that their availability would be evanescent. The specter of the 404 not found error was particularly galling to librarians who valued long-term information accessibility. So by housing this information within the IR, the hope was that its long-term availability would be assured. This third promise, highlighting the depth and the breadth of the institution's intellectual output. So there's this idea that the IR would be a good promotional tool for recruiting students and faculty, and for fundraising, for alumni relations, and for profile building among the general public. The IR could show the world what a school was up to, what its organized research units were all about, how innovative individual faculty members were, and how the school was taking the lead in specific subject areas. Rather than a hodgepodge of individual departmental and personal pages operated by graduate students and maybe potentially disgruntled IT personnel, the IR could paint these pictures more efficiently and more professionally by organizing information, by maximizing accessibility, and by building a UI that supported this marketing mission. It was a more strategic approach to information dissemination. The fourth promise, the accelerating effect on the information wants to be free movement, including open access. Well, the evolution of the IR corresponds roughly with the rise of this, what I said, this information wants to be free movement. And I think that how repositories and open access have intermingled over time it's convoluted and it's somewhat opaque. And I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but there are several observations that I guess I'd like to make. The first is that both IRs and open access seek to eliminate the access costs, again, the access costs, subscription fees that are associated with traditional scholarly communication. Secondly, both open access and institutional repositories seek to leverage technology, specifically the lowered operational and dissemination costs associated with electronic workflows, to reduce the production expenses associated with traditional scholarly communication. Thirdly, like the open access movement, IRs held the promise of shaking up the traditional economics of publishing. While open access does this in its most common implementation by shifting to an author pays model, the institutional repository was seen as potentially changing the game by placing the university in a role akin to publisher. The thought was that the IR's imprimatur would perhaps take the place of a traditional publisher's seal of approval, at least in some cases, over time. So, in terms of this fifth promise, potential breeding ground for a new generation of university-founded journals, very much related to this idea of the university's imprimatur and the IR's imprimatur becoming a de facto publisher. I think there was this notion that the IR could contain much of the editorial and production mechanisms that were necessary to operate electronic journals. The IR could, as a consequence, make it much easier to launch new journals without aid of a commercial or a society publisher. There's a corollary here that the IR and the various publishing opportunities that it provided would prove useful in helping the institution to retain some of the intellectual capital produced under its auspices rather than ceding that capital to other outlets as is traditionally the norm. And here what I mean is, I think you all know the equation. The university, by and large, funds a researcher's activities. The researcher conducts research. Off of that decides to write a paper, writes that paper, again, on the university's dime, typically submits it to a journal, usually or often a commercial journal. That journal or a journal decides to publish it. They do a little bit of work on their end, and then they sell that intellectual capital back to the university, the same university that funded the work to begin with. And I think that sticks in the craw of a lot of universities, and I think with some good reason. And so the institutional repository was seen as a way to change the game in that regard. I should mention you're looking at a blank slide here. I didn't really have anything to display, so I thought I'd return us at least for a few seconds to the grace and the spirit of Olympic champion Sarah Hughes. There she is. Now, the sixth promise. I should mention, by the way, that because you're muted, I'm assuming you're all chortling and chuckling and laughing, and it's terrifying to think that you're rolling your eyes as an alternative. So I'll picture that first scenario in my own head. Promise number 6 is low adoption costs for authors. And the idea here is that the IR would be straightforward to secure faculty participation. The software is simple to use. Posting takes just a few minutes. And there was an assumption that the small hassle associated with posting would be more than outweighed by the wider dissemination of content, its long-term accessibility, the so-called rising tide benefit of being part of an expansive and an important collection, and the elimination of the need for clunky and difficult to manage personal and departmental pages. So there was a thought that, hey, we're going to see that author adoption is easy, and that this would mean, as a result, that libraries could reasonably and effectively run point on the sort of rollout and marketing and content acquisition aspects of the institutional repository. So in terms of a scorecard, if you will, what follows is a wholly subjective, admittedly wholly subjective assessment of how fully the institutional repository has lived up to these 6 promises. And I'm going to stick to my running theme here and rank these on a Hughes scale of 1 to 4, with 4 golden Sarahs, meaning that, at least in my opinion, the promise has been fully met. As a concrete response to the scholarly communication crisis, I would give institutional repositories 3 golden Sarahs out of a possible 4. Why is this? Well, I think that they have put the university in a proactive, forward-leaning stance as it explores ways to lower the costs associated with information dissemination. The institutional repository has, as I previously mentioned, pushed publishers to change their policies in relation to the free dissemination of at least some version of a published article. And that's a pretty dramatic change over the past few years. Additionally, the IR has proven to be a viable home for the monograph and for the edited volume and for other niche publications. Dozens of schools, and some of them are in conjunction with their university presses and some are not, but dozens of schools now offer a monographic publishing program as part of their IR. I can't say that the institutional repository has conclusively ended the scholarly communications crisis, but I think it has ended or mitigated at least some of the more troublesome aspects of the scholarly communications crisis. In terms of the expanded access to scholarly information, I would give this 2.5 Sarahs. On the plus side, institutional repositories have delivered eyeballs to the literature. That's the bottom line. BPress's Research Now database, which is a sort of meta-repository site that allows for searching across the 70 or so digital commons installations, has logged more than 10 million full-text downloads in the last 365 days. And the vast majority of these are for working papers and for other non-journal content. IRs has simply made this type of content more accessible, and I think that's pretty important. Also on the plus side, these materials are a lot more likely to be available, to be viable, to be locatable in 5 or 10 years' time when compared to the old tangle of personal and departmental web pages. Librarians simply care a lot more about curating and archiving than any other stakeholder in the sort of scholarly communication chain. And it's their oversight of the IR that I think provides a healthy guarantee that repository deposits are not going to be 404'd anytime soon. On the negative side, when it comes to expanding access to scholarly information, you'll recall that earlier I outlined that one of the big hopes of the institutional repository was that it could be a mechanism to categorically collect and to categorize and to disseminate data sets and multimedia files and executables and other non-static and non-traditional information. And I think that this has simply not happened in any substantive way. It's undoubtedly true that we have seen some interesting experiments along these lines, and I suspect that some of our attendees might be able to provide examples of what's going on at their institutions when it comes to multimedia content and non-traditional content. But at the end of the day, we just haven't seen the IR render the dissemination of non-static materials a commonplace occurrence. While the institutional repository has made this technically possible, it has thus far failed to change behaviors and incentivize people to actually deposit and participate in this way. In terms of highlighting the depth and the breadth of the institution's intellectual output, I would give this 2 golden Sarahs. Many schools have placed a special emphasis within their repository on specific subjects or specific programs where they as a body excel. The IR has definitely proven to be a good central deposit place for collecting disparate materials that emphasize a school's leadership in a certain subject and looking across disciplines, taking a cross-disciplinary approach to something. And some examples of these that I could cite would be Boston College has a Church in the 21st Century series, which I think is very interesting. Cornell has an Industrial and Labor Relations collection, which I think is probably among the best in the world, deposited in their IR. On the downside, though, I'm not aware of many, frankly, if any, instances where an institution is actively coordinating its repository activities with an alumni association, or with a fundraising drive, or with a central campus PR campaign. The institutional repository may indeed be a treasure trove of valuable information that demonstrates leadership and innovation in a specific discipline or subject area, but it's not clear to me if anything is being done to systematically leverage this potentially golden asset. The IR certainly has the potential to be a very effective and valuable marketing tool, but I don't really believe that this potential has been anywhere close to fully realized as yet. So in terms of this accelerating effect on the information wants to be free movement, I think that this has been one of the bigger successes of the IR era. I would say it's a 3 Sarah achievement. There simply is not, or rather, there simply is a lot of information that is more readily available today than there was in 2000 or 2002. The Oyster database, which probably you're familiar with, but which aggregates open access content, It contains nearly 20 million records at this point. And certainly, by no means are all of those materials institutional repository deposits, but a lot of them are. And you know, I'm not sure that the growth of repositories, institutional repositories, or the rise of open access publishing, for that matter, has caused information providers and publishers to radically change the way they go about their business. Having said that, institutional repositories have helped create an expectation among researchers, particularly the younger generation, that some form of the materials they seek may be freely accessible to them with a modest amount of web exploration. And I suspect this will be one of the more lasting impacts of the IR on the scholarly communication realm. Basically the notion that if you're looking for scholarly content and you go online and you do a Google search, you have now, or one has, a reasonable expectation that that one will be able to discover, find the materials in question with just a few clicks, and to be able to get access to that full text and to not have to pay for it. And that the IR, I think, has played a pretty large role in that paradigmatic shift. Moving along. The IR as a potential breeding ground for a new generation of university-founded e-journals. I would give this 2.5 golden ferrets, and I'll explain my reasoning there. The institutional repository has, in many cases, lowered the barriers to the launch of new e-journals. Again, going back to the Digital Commons example, because it's the one I know best, Digital Commons has been used to produce, I think, close to 150 open access e-journals at this point, so electronic journals that are part of an institutional repository. And that number is really impressive, and it's put it in context. It's more than Hindawi, which is a major open access publisher. It's more journals than they have, and it's within the ballpark. It's a few dozen less than Biomed Central, which everyone thinks is the open access publisher. It's only a few dozen less than what Biomed Central publishes. So really, what we've seen is IRs have helped facilitate the establishment and the production of electronic journals. But I'll make two critical comments here as well. And the first is that the reduction in cost and effort that it takes to start a journal is not all for the good. And the reason is because it encourages vanity publications or half-hearted endeavors and other projects that are likely to add clutter rather than clarity to the scholarly communication picture. The second criticism, the second observation I'll make is that in most instances, the journal launches seem to have taken place in a vacuum. There's just been too little coordination with other campus units. So there hasn't been much coordination with the university press, or again the marketing department, or really other the office, vice chancellors for research office, things like that. And the result is that what we see are random buds, if you will, that start out across the scholarly terrain, as opposed to something that would resemble a well-tended and planned garden. In terms of this next screen, you recall that the sixth promise of the institutional repository was that it would be straightforward to secure faculty participation. And not to end this section on too much of a downer, but this gets our lowest golden Sarah rating of the presentation, which is 1.5 golden Sarahs. The software, from a technical standpoint, the software has indeed proven relatively simple to use. Posting actually does only take a few minutes, as was the promise, but scholars have, by and large, been unconvinced that even that modest effort of posting is outweighed by the benefits of wider dissemination, long-term accessibility, and so forth. And as a result, content acquisition has been it's been a slog. I'm sure you all have stories to tell, those of you on the line who have repositories, but the bottom line is, at least as I see it, is that most authors either don't feel like it's easy to participate or don't feel like it's worth their efforts to participate. And this has forced the library to be more creative and more aggressive in its marketing efforts. And I don't think that's a task for which the library is ideally suited. I think when we're talking about advanced marketing techniques and advanced content acquisition and advanced faculty outreach efforts, I don't think that's in the library's breadbasket, and I don't think it's reasonable to expect that they would excel in those areas. Taken collectively, in terms of these 6 promises and the fulfillment of those promises, that is how I see the institutional repository world as it is reflected in the rearview mirror. We've certainly done some things well, and we've missed the mark in some other areas. And what I'd like to do, as we pivot into the second half of the conversation, is to turn our attention towards how the institutional repository fits into the broader scholarly communication continuum. And to delve into this issue, I think it would be first helpful to define some terms. I recently had a consulting engagement with a major trade organization to create a professional development course concentrating on scholarly communication. And one thing that was quickly apparent was that everyone at the table had a different view as to exactly what scholarly communication is. And after some back and forth, we forged a definition that is the one that I'll use here. It's the one you see on your screen. Scholarly communication refers to the formal and the informal processes by which the research and scholarship of academics, researchers, and independent scholars are created, evaluated, edited, formatted, distributed, organized, made accessible, archived, used, and transformed. And I'm going to dig into that with some specificity over the next couple slides. So if we're talking about the role that the institutional repository plays within this larger scholarly communication landscape, I think we need to parse that definition a bit. To start with, the first parse is that scholarly communication refers to formal and informal processes. And I think the institutional repository can, in fact, straddle the formal and the informal quite effectively. On the informal side, it can transmit newsletters and seminar presentations and lectures and other evanescent content forms. Although it's worth noting that institutional repositories have not, by and large, incorporated really informal communications like blogs and instant messaging and Twittering and so forth. I'll get to that in just a few minutes. But I also want to mention this first parse that IRs obviously can incorporate the formal processes, most obviously observed in the peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes that they house. The second piece of the definition that I'd like to parse is by which the research and scholarship of academics, researchers, and independent scholars. So I'd say it does both of those things. I think that in terms of research and scholarship, it encompasses, and it really can deal with a wide variety of actors and accommodate a wide variety of actors. I think the IR has played an important role in expanding the range of content that scholars of all stripes and all pay grades can expose to the world at large, really. It's proven to be a simple and effective and low-cost way to disseminate a broad array of information for those scholars who have recognized the benefits of participation. In other words, if you get what an IR is all about, you can do a lot of different things with it. Whether you're the the vice provost of the institution or a junior professor, you can use the IR to your advantage. The third part of the definition that I'd highlight is talking about how the creation, the evaluation, the editing, the formatting, the distribution, the organization, the accessibility, the archiving, the use, and the transformation of information. And in this side, or in this piece of the equation, I think we need to talk about what the IR is and is not. It is not a scholar's workspace. It is not a scholar's workbench. And by that I mean that all the tasks that go into content creation are really not part of the IR experience. It's only after the work is quote-unquote done that the IR really enters into the equation. So if we're to use this definition of scholarly communication, creation, evaluation, editing, and formatting are usually, not always, but usually, out of the IR mix, while distribution, organization, accessibility, archiving, use, and transformation, the IR does play a role in all those processes. So taken collectively, I think what we see is that the institutional repository does in fact play a useful tool in furthering many aspects of scholarly communication. I also think, and I'll talk about this next, that this is truer for some forms of scholarly communication than for other forms. And here, I think we need to think a little bit about how scholars communicate. You see sort of a foursquare on your screen, hopefully. Communication can be formal and it can be informal. It can be permanent and it can be impermanent. And what's interesting to me is to think about just how effectively the institutional repository services each of these quadrants. There are communications that are formal and permanent, so things like journal articles and monographs and books. I think that the IR plays an important role in this quadrant by expanding access to alternative versions of commercially held properties. So by saying, you know, you used to get this from a commercial publisher, we have an alternative that you can access via the IR. I think the IR also plays a role in this quadrant by changing the economic models for specialty publications and by stretching the long tail as a result. And here I'm again thinking about things like monographs, where the economics of monograph publishing were just crippling. I mean, it just does not really work to do print monograph publishing. That's not to say that that content form is not important. It is important. And something like the institutional repository can provide a mechanism for monographs to be, quote unquote, published and disseminated, and can lower the cost dramatically so that this content form can in fact survive. So looking at a different quadrant, there are communications that are informal and permanent, like a working paper or a preprint. And I would argue that the IR has significantly impacted the scholarly communication landscape by making this specific quadrant a much more arable place. Content that is not destined to end up in a journal or a bound volume or on a library stack is substantially more viable today as a result of the institutional repository. There's just a lot more informal but permanent content that we as a community have access to. The IR has given that type of content a home. The fortune of communications that are formal and impermanent, and here by impermanent I mean that they're delivered in the moment without much thought given to their long-term viability, but the fortunes of these communications have been similarly, though less dramatically impacted by the rise of the IR. Here again I'm thinking about things like presentations and speeches and seminars. This information can now be captured and exposed to a wider audience. It used to be that you had to be there. You had to be there in the room, in the moment, or rely on someone else's note-taking or someone else's interpretation of events if you were not, in fact, present at their happening. What we see now is that video and audio and PowerPoints can all be captured. They can be served. They can be curated. And that the IR is a logical home for those materials. I mentioned that I thought that this quadrant has been impacted by the IR, but maybe not quite so dramatically. And the reason I say that is because that IRs provide the capacity to house this type of information, but I think the uptake has been rather slow. I mean, we just don't see IRs filled to the brim with this type of material. And this remains an ongoing challenge, I think, for IRs. And finally, the last quadrant, there are communications that are both impermanent and informal. You know, here I'm thinking about things like IMs and emails and texts and blog posts and so forth. As I mentioned in the last slide, the IR does very little here. And, you know, one question to think about is, should it? Should the IR do more? Should the IR be adapted to incorporate these types of materials? Well, download counts and other metrics certainly tell us that there's an audience for informal works and that there's an audience for impermanent works. The question is there an audience for informal and impermanent works that are informal and impermanent? And if so, how is this material best captured, best categorized, best organized, and preserved? And I don't pretend to have an answer to that. It's just one of the questions that we face as we look forward into the future of institutional repositories. I should say that I was really happy to speak in Denver to keynote the ALCTS group, and I'm happy to have this great webinar slot. But I confess that I don't have any special foreknowledge regarding the future of institutional repositories. These are open questions to me as well. One interesting development, though, that I can mention is the pursuit of a single deposit tool, a common deposit mechanism. At a NISO thought leader meeting that I chaired just about a year ago, several big thinkers in the IR space blue skied a utility that would render the incremental cost of depositing across multiple domains virtually nil. The idea is that we should try to create a tool that exposes scholarly objects to their creator's choice of multiple deposit domains. And here what I'm talking about is you create an object, you create a paper or whatever it may be, and you should be able to easily deposit that or expose it to journals and to content management systems and to subject matter repositories and to learning object repositories and course management systems and, of course, the institutional repository. If you could sort of have a common deposit mechanism, check several boxes. I want to go here, here, not here, here, and here, and just click send or deliver. That would make the author or the creator's life a lot easier. The current reality is that a scholar creates something and then must follow several submission paths to give it life in all the places where it could have life. And I think that is really impeding the success of the institutional repository. This potential consolidation of effort in which the IR deposit would be no more difficult than checking another box seems to me to be a promising way to clear this hurdle. And I should mention that a couple things. One is that I'm not sure what, if anything, NISO is going to do to pursue this concept, and also others are pursuing this as well. There are lots of interestingly acronymed initiatives like SWORD and Spectra and Increase and AIR. They all sound like James Bond villainous organizations. But I called out the NISO one simply because it's the one that I'm most familiar with. But a lot of these initiatives are trying to tackle that same issue. Beyond common deposit mechanism, the question is what other factors will impact the IR as it approaches adolescence. And I suspect that the impact of Web 2.0 will play a role. The emerging generation of scholars spends its time on the internet sharing things. They share pictures and videos and theories and gripes and thoughts and so on. And the way that they use the consumer internet, if you will no doubt influence and impact how they use academic sites. Looking ahead, it seems likely that scholars, especially, again, students and younger professionals, will want access to more raw data and more unfettered communication. There's just this notion of let's just get things out there and let's just throw it into the ether and see what happens. I suspect they're also going to want it with lower barriers. They're going to want materials and information more quickly and at less expense, delivered in a format and a medium of their choosing, and probably to a device of their choosing. How this is relevant for IRs is that their infrastructures and their services, the IR infrastructures and services, are going to need to grow more flexible and more nimble to meet these expectations. The last issue that I'll talk about today is mandates. We've seen with Harvard, most notably, that institutions may decide to use the IR as part of a larger set of policies and strategies. As yet, the list of schools that has followed suit in terms of mandating that their faculty deposit scholarly materials in open access repositories, the number of schools that are creating these mandates is still relatively small. Stanford School of Education is a good example. Macquarie University, Boston University had an announcement recently. These are some of the notable mandators. But should other institutions begin requiring their faculty to archive copies of their funded research, I would say almost undoubtedly the institutional repository would see its prominence increase. So that's really all that I can say about the future, at least all I can say in the allotted time. I should say, that returning to our comedic theme, as we look to the future, you should also look out for Mirai Nagasu, who's the Junior Grand Prix champion, the U.S., and is definitely a threat for the 2000 Vancouver Olympics. So that is all that formally I have on the docket. I can say I'm a little bit confused, if you will, in terms of how the best way to try and ask questions, or if people have questions. I guess probably the best way to do it is, if people have questions, maybe they can enter them now into the text box, and I can read them off and do my best to answer them. I'll also mention that if you're at an institution that's contemplating launching an institution repository, or one that's wrestling with some of the issues that we discussed today, just to put in a plug for myself, one of the consulting services that I do offer is on-site strategic planning, workshopping, general IR, jump-starting, and you should feel free to email me if you want to learn more about that. But let's see this. If anyone has questions, please enter them now, and I will do my best to address them. I am waiting, and I don't see much coming up here. Oh, here's one. I'm sorry. There are a couple here. Let's see. Do you think it's easier for a repository that focuses on a single discipline to fully realize its potential? That is a good question, and I certainly think this notion of a subject matter repository is a good one. Subject matter repositories have an advantage in that if a researcher or a student or an academic is trying to research a specific subject, they don't often go to the University of Nebraska's website, or they don't often go to Purdue's website. They're more used to thinking in subject terms rather than in institutional terms. So I think it probably is slightly easier for a disciplinary repository to fully realize its potential. I mean, we've seen some success there. We've also seen an increase in attempts over the last couple of years in trying to create this. What is interesting is there's a potential free rider problem, in the sense that if you are an institution and you say, we are going to be the repository for atmospheric sciences, or we are going to be the repository for industrial and labor relations, are you going to be housing content and materials from contributors that are not at your institution? It seems like you would have to do that. And if you are trying to do that, are you getting any sort of financial relief for doing that? Are you getting any sort of participation assistance from other institutions that might benefit? So that's these are interesting questions, and I don't have a concrete answer. I have another question about whether the library is the appropriate body to do outreach and marketing, and I think that is a good question. Is it, in fact, a good place or a good body for doing those types of activities? In some ways, the library is ideally suited to do outreach. I mean, librarians definitely have a good sense of what faculty is doing. They're in touch, and they certainly understand via subject liaisons, for example, what's going on in given departments. And so I think they often do have a good connection with faculty members. But I think this is more of a skill set issue, in the sense that librarians aren't trained to do marketing. And marketers aren't trained to be librarians, of course, as well. But what it takes when it comes to figuring out, there are companies that have teams of people that do outreach marketing, and these are trained professionals, and it is a complex business. I did this, a dozen years ago. I did outreach marketing for EndNote, and I know that a lot of work goes into it. And I think it's a lot to ask for libraries librarians to fill that role. It's not to say that they can't. I just think it can potentially be a bit of a stretch. Another question I have is, how do we assess the need for these programs on our campus and know that we are offering a needed service? And that's a good question. You know, when repositories first came to be, there was a great rush for everyone to start a repository. And I remember, you know, when I was running bpress, we had Digital Commons, and we were, in a sense, we were competing with DSpace, meaning schools are trying to decide, do we want to do DSpace or do we want to do research now? And the folks at DSpace trumpeted as a selling point, as a marketing bullet point. They trumpeted the fact that they had it was over 1,000 downloads of their source code. And I said, well, that really is a marketing selling point for us, because you may have had 1,000 downloads of your source code, but how many active, vibrant repositories do you actually have? You know, do you have 10, 15, 100? You know, it's a very small percentage, because schools were saying we need to do something with a repository. We need to have a repository solution. We need to get a repository up and running. But they weren't really sure what that all meant, and in fact, why they needed to do that, if they needed to do it. So I think one of the things you need to think about if you're contemplating starting a repository is, why do we want to do this? Do we want to preserve that content, that intellectual output which is being produced within our institution's auspices? Do we want to establish subject matter leadership in a specific discipline? Do we want to use this as a tool to promote to potential students, potential graduate students, potential faculty members, potential donors, the vibrancy of our intellectual activities? You know, do we worry that there is going to be a degradation in, or a loss of availability of these materials over time if we don't step in and curate? Do we worry that it is difficult to and inefficient to maintain a series of parallel websites, you know, at the departmental or the individual faculty member level? These are all questions. Now, you know, in doing that, I think you probably need to have questions, or you need to have conversations with faculty members. You need to have conversations with you know, vice chancellors, with you know, with the administration, and you know, things like you know, things like surveys and brown bag lunches and things like that, to get a sense of, hey, do we really want and do we really need to do this? Because to do it just to do it, or to do it because you think faculty should use this, or you think faculty would benefit if only we had it, we're all very busy people, and to do things speculatively, or to do things because you think you can convince people, hey, this is in your best interest, I don't think you want to go down that road. I mean, that's what we saw in that initial rush where schools were saying, we're going to create repositories, and they built these big ornate systems, and they sat largely unpopulated. Other questions. Here's a question. Are there any tools to help institutions determine what the best platform is for their setting? That is a good question. And you know, certainly there is a buy versus build question, which is the, you know, the fundamental question. Is it cheaper, and is it more efficient to do this in-house and to use an open source system and to run it locally? Is it cheaper and more efficient to contract out? And it depends on your institution, and you know, I think it's really important to actually cost out both solutions fully. So it's not just a question of, you know, paying bpress's licensing fee, because who's going to be doing the outreach, who's going to be doing the support, and so forth. It's not just a question of downloading DSpace's source code, because who's going to be maintaining it, who's going to operate the servers, and again, who's going to be doing the outreach and all these other things. I have done some work. I know others have done some work on the sort of true costs of repositories and what one can reasonably expect in direct and indirect costs. So I would say a literature search would be useful. And if anyone has specific questions about how they, as an institution, might go about this, I would invite you to email me, and we can certainly talk about it in more detail. Another question is, who should fill the outreach role if not the library? Which is a really good question. it depends on the school. I always thought that the alumni association and again the vice chancellor for research office and external relations, public relations. I always thought that they had a bigger role to play, not necessarily a role in sort of running the tactical point of the repository, but I thought that a successful repository would be one that involved them in the discussion. But I think that's been one of the true questions which has held back the repositories, is that there's not a natural owner. It doesn't migrate to the IT department, or it doesn't migrate to the graduate school. And so the libraries have said, look, we'll take ownership of this. But it is, it is not clear if not the library, then who? That's a good question. Another question: if a common deposit mechanism is developed, who should determine appropriateness, quality, and so forth? I mean, I do think there will need to be some entity that plays the gatekeeper role, so that a professor couldn't just say, or a researcher couldn't just say, I have this object, I want it in the course management system, I want it deposited in the physics archive, I want it deposited in the institutional repository, I want it on my personal page, and so forth. And what I think is undoubtedly true is there are gatekeepers for all of those mechanisms individually now. So you have, you have 6 people playing that role depending on the context, wherein, that we certainly could gain efficiencies by having one person do that. And I think, someone in a central administrative capacity, which could be in the library certainly, because, in that instance, the library does have a good sense of, well, where is it appropriate to expose certain material, or through what mechanisms is it appropriate to expose certain materials? That's a question the library gets, so I could see the library playing an active role there. Next question, and I'm burning through these. I hope that's okay. The biggest hurdle we've seen to open access in IRs is that our researchers want to submit only the definitive version, the publisher's PDF, into the IR. Most publishers don't allow this. Do you see changes to publishers' attitudes that might affect this? That is a very good question. Publishers have made a pretty large concession in the sense that, and I'm agnostic, I should confess. I'm agnostic when it comes to open access. I can see it working in some places, and I can see how it causes problems in other places. But publishers have made a pretty big concession, which is that, look, you can have access to, and in a sense republication rights to, a certain version of this article, and before that was not the case. I understand why they're not having the publisher's PDF be the version. I suspect in 5 or 10 years this is going to be an irrelevant discussion, in part because the distinction between the post-print version and the quote-unquote final published version is just not going to make much difference. I mean, I was on the LibLicense listserv just recently talking about this, and it makes a difference to us as people who care about how information is curated and care about version control and things like that. But to the 9 out of 10 readers or 99 out of 100 readers, it's not going to make that big of a difference. If the content is, or the content itself is fundamentally the same in the post-print version versus the published version, the reader, the consumer of the content, isn't going to worry too much about the sort of subtle form changes or format changes. So what I would say is the publishers' attitudes are evolving on this issue because the issue itself is evolving, and I think what we will see is some publishers will realize that the horse is already out of the barn, if you will, that when they made the decision to allow the post-print version to be publicly accessible, that really opened the door to what we're talking about being the finished product, the finished intellectual product of the article being available, and the distinction is too fine-grained to really matter in the long run. I think some publishers, forward-leaning publishers, will eventually, and I've talked to publishers about this over the years, will work with universities, and I know University of California and I think Springer recently signed an agreement where postprints are going to be automatically deposited into the institutional repository, that we're not going to rely on the authors to upload the author version and have to deal with vetting of version controls and things like that. That publishers are actually going to encompass, or are going to have this be part of the subscription negotiations and licenses. And whether what UC does gets replicated elsewhere will be interesting to see. I'm going to give a last call for questions because I see that we're running up against the time. I will see. It looks like that's all we have, and so I really. Excuse me. I want to thank you, and I know Pamela wants to thank you, so I'm going to turn it over to her. But again, if anyone has any questions, Greg at scholarnext.com. I'm happy to answer them. So I'm going to turn it over to Pamela now, who I hope is on the line.
Thank you, Greg, very much. I'm trying to get my screen back here. Can't get my next slide up for some reason. I don't know why. I knew there would be a technical problem. Why is this not working here? Just give me 1 second. All right, I'll do it this way. Thank you, Greg, very much for your excellent introduction to the topic of institutional repositories. This concludes the introductory webinar on institutional repositories. Thank you all very much for participating. We hope you found it useful. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Also, you should know that this session was recorded, and in a few days you will probably receive a message from the ALCTS office giving you instructions on where you can listen to the recording again. The comments that you make on the evaluation are very important for us, and because we will be using them to plan additional continuing education offerings. As you will see on your screen, the next webinar in this series will take place on Wednesday, May the 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Marilyn Moody, Dean of the University Library at Boise State University in Boise, Idaho, will discuss strategies for promoting and distributing scholarship and research in a topic entitled Beyond the Institutional Repository, Campus Research Distribution Strategies. Cindy and I would also like to thank Carrie Cassio for her assistance in familiarizing us with the webinar software. Carrie has been lurking behind the scenes today to make sure that we got it right here. We sincerely appreciate your attendance today and look forward to having you join us again next month. So with that, we're going to sign off, and thank you again very much for attending. We look forward to reading your evaluations.